cerebellar connections with grade 3 are much more common because it's much more severe. You're getting more brainstem involvement in that case.
Yeah, I was gonna say, is it because it's brainstem and it's just lower?
Yep. And I also need to turn on the fans in the horse's loafing shed. There we go. So
The what? Oh, the
fans.
horses need.
Yeah, I got fans mounted on the ceiling, and I just saw that they were out in the loafing shed, so I need to turn the fans on for them.
So in terms of horses, do they have like a pretty cush life because they have fans, or are they living a little rough life in comparison to other horses?
They're pets. They're pets.
Make sure they're cool.
Yeah, I don't really have to worry about the heat so much. It also helps keep the flies off of them. So
when you are a gentleman farmer with all your internet, do you actually have to go outside and farm?
oh yeah, yeah. Yep.
Okay.
The wind still blows trees down on the fences. Yeah.
It's
all
not your farmland isn't fully AI integrated.
If I can get a drone
Automated.
that'll run a chainsaw for me, I'll be a man. That sounds dangerous to me anyway.
Yeah. We got about 2 more minutes. We'll get started. We still got
Once Skynet takes over, you don't want to be the guy that taught a drone to run a chainsaw.
someday. Is anyone else getting like a little clicking? I just so you all know, I can't figure that out. I switched headphones multiple times, so I don't know if it's our connection of some sort. So for our
Is
listeners,
it still doing it now?
no, it's like coming and going. So I might just have to I might change some chords next time before our next presentation. So for our listeners, if you're getting some clicking, okay.
Getting anything now?
Mm-mm.
Okay, good. I was making sure it wasn't me moving around in my chair.
No, it's definitely in our studio. So for our
Okay.
listeners, doesn't sound.
I'm not hearing it on my end.
Okay. So it's probably just Don and I.
Of course, when you mention it, it goes away. So that was
No,
good.
no. Just keep talking about it.
Just have to bring it up every 5 minutes or so.
Okay. Jeff, you ready to get going here?
Oh yeah, ready when you are.
Good deal. Well, it's 9 o'clock. We are going to kick off this month's webinar series here. Welcome, Don from studio today.
Good morning.
Laura, welcome from Denver.
Morning.
And we have Dr. Snell from the East Coast. Welcome again, Dr. Snell.
Jeff's in Virginia. Yep. Hi guys.
Glad to have you. We are going to be talking about the cerebellum today. As for those of you who are listening in previously, before we kick things off, I'm really excited for this topic. The cerebellum is something that I've just been interested in as a clinician, and it's always these individuals with cerebellar injuries are always really fun to work with. You can really push them pretty hard. But as you're going to learn, it's more than just a motor area of the brain. So I'm excited to hear Dr. Snell dive into that a bit more deeply. Before we kick it over to Dr. Snell, just a little bit of housekeeping. You can go ahead and advance, Jeff. Just a little bit about QLI. For those of you who are familiar, welcome back. We love having individuals on the audience side join us month to month. So it's always good to see some familiar folks joining us. But if you're new to QLI, QLI is a post-acute rehab, and we do have an outpatient tele-rehab program as well. But we specialize in helping individuals with traumatic brain injuries, spinal cord injuries, chronic pain, limb loss, and stroke recover from those injuries and get back to life. You can see the photo here on the screen. This is our campus on the northeastern side of Omaha. We sit on about 65 acres of land. About half of it is developed. So we're just fortunate to have really great facilities with really great people. So if you happen to be listening and you happen to be in Omaha or want to come to Omaha, we'd love to host you. So offers on the table. Some quick housekeeping. Please use the Q&A for any questions between myself, Don, and Laura. We will monitor that. We will ask Jeff to either answer them along the way. Jeff, if you see something, go ahead and answer it. Otherwise, we will wait to the end and get through as many of those as we can. Jeff is always really great at following up after presentations and answering any Q&A that pops up too. So please, we love the Q&A. We love the interaction on that regard. In terms of CEUs, our CEUs are free and they are for CCMC only. So for those of you who don't have that, we apologize, but thanks for joining us anyways. To get those CEUs, we just ask that you attend the majority of the presentation. There will be a poll question, just one question at the end of the presentation. There will be a slide to call that out. We will launch it. It's a true or false question, and that's one thing that we need you to do. And then once you leave our webinar, you should get prompted, and it should kick you to your browser where you'll fill out a job form, and that will initiate any CEUs that are provided, as well as the CEU slides. So we know some of you do have challenges with that because of things on your end, such as pop-up blockers and things like that. Just let us know, and we will help you out with that. So that's the housekeeping. We'll review that again at the end. Want to make sure that you all are taken care of in terms of CEUs. All right, should we get going? Jeff, you ready to roll?
I suppose so. I just had a couple of those little power interruptions that I was talking about as well. So, but I'm still here. So the battery backup worked like it's supposed to. Lights just blinked off, and okay, there.
We're
That's out of the way.
We're fortunate you can live off the grid on your end. So
Definitely.
all
Yep.
you.
Okay. Well, we are talking today about the cerebellum. The cerebellum that you saw within the title slide. The subtitle for this is the little brain. And the reason that we have that as a subtitle is that is what cerebellum means in Latin. It is the little brain. The cerebellum is a very tightly packed grouping of cells, heavily populated by several distinct types of neurons that exist only within the cerebellum. Although it makes up only about 10% of the brain's volume, it contains around 80% of the total neurons within the brain. And that is owing to a large population of exceptionally small neuronal cells. That is something that I've had to update over the past few years. And talking about the cerebellum used to be, they said it was probably about 60% of the brain's neurons. They've actually upped that to 80% at this point. So the vast majority of neurons within the brain, the fast-acting, fast-communicating cells that we think of as being the primary driver of, what our brain is capable of doing, the vast majority of those are located in the cerebellum. So that would suggest that it has a very, very large role in what our brain does. The average surface area of the cerebral cortex, here pictured kind of lightly and above, that's really what you think of when somebody says brain and you picture a brain in your head. That's what you picture, that large kind of wrinkled mass that fills our cranial cavity. The surface area of that cerebral cortex is roughly the size of a standard pillowcase. It's around 2,000 square centimeters, or around 310 square inches. So if you took all the folds and grooves of the brain and you flattened it out, that is about the size. And that relatively large surface area is then confined to a much smaller space by being folded on itself. So those deep folds and ridges that extend down inside the surface area as well. So all those folds and grooves allow that larger surface area to exist within a smaller space. Now, the cerebellum that we're talking about today, again, makes up about 10% of the brain's volume, but in terms of surface area, the cerebellum is approximately 78% that of the cerebral cortex. So it's only about a 20% smaller pillowcase, and it's packed into an even more tightly folded structure. So in terms of the number of neurons and the complexity of their interconnections, it beats the cerebral cortex hands down, and primarily has to do with the wealth of very small neurons located within one of the layers of the cerebellum. Now, we know a lot more about the cerebral cortex than we do about the cerebellum. And we're going to talk about why that is through this presentation today. Part of it has to do with the ability to differentiate and map functional abilities to specific locations within the cortex. So in other words, we know that within, the left temporal area, there is a place, the kind of where junction is near the left frontal area as well. that is called Broca's area. That is our expressive speech area, and the damage to that area results in an inability to produce motor speech. It is right adjacent to and part of the motor strip. There's a great deal of difficulty in performing the same types of analyses and differentiation on the cerebellum. And as we'll discuss, the cerebellum also operates on different principles and has much more fluid organization. It is made up of left and right hemispheres. So on the right-hand side of the graphic there, you see the blue and purple, the left and right hemispheres. And then there's a narrow mid-zone there on the left, kind of pictured with a little bit of an orange stripe, called the vermis. That, if you translate it from Latin or into Latin, that would be worm. So that is the worm part of the cerebellum. There are folds of the cerebellum that are typically used to divide the cerebellum's overall structure into 10 smaller lobules. This graphic simplifies the labeling of those lobules because they're a little trickier to see on the actual physical structure. These lobules are very similar in their structural organization. In other words, each are similar to the other. The way in which they are built and the way in which they process information, from 4, from 8, they're practically identical in how they're built and in how they process. These lobules are very similar again in organization, and they've been likened to a parallel processor network of similar neural circuits. Now, this is different than the distinct areas of the cerebral cortex in which specific areas can be identified as directly related to movement, to speech, to vision, to sensation, to other neurological functions. I'm sure that you have at one time or another seen the homunculus, the little man pictured overlying the motor strip or the sensory strip of the brain, with the proportional areas of the body representing the amount of brain tissue devoted to either motor movement in that area or sensory perception in that area. You can't do the same thing with the cerebellum. It interacts with all the different areas of the cerebral cortex in refining, in coordinating, and in automating cerebral processes. And when I say cerebral processes, I mean all cerebral processes. And this is very, very different than a traditional view of the cerebellum as exclusively associated with motor movement, with refining motor movement. It also refines in the same way, as we will talk about, other aspects of cerebral functioning, which includes cognition, which includes emotional functioning as well. The interior structure of the cerebellum is analogous to the central white matter pathways of the cerebral cortex. It is called the arbor vitae, again, back to Latin, tree of life. And this is the white matter distribution network that passes signals to the gray matter, those tightly packed cells within the outer layers in the cortex of the cerebellum. This white matter is made up of bundles of axons servicing distinct lobules, facilitating communication back and forth, primarily with the cerebral cortex, but also to some degree with the spinal column itself. There are some cerebellar reflexes that can be induced or observed when doing a physical assessment that are exclusively communication between the spinal column and the cerebellum. Now, in computer terms, these multiple different identical styled organization allows for multiple parallel operations and simultaneous distinct communication between different areas of the cerebral and cerebellar cortices. So in other words, you can have multiple different things going on at the same time, all being shunted in and out of the cerebellum by way of those white matter pathways. And again, like I said, it is very similar to the white matter within the brain, which are, again, bundles of axons. You get a bunch of myelinated axons together, and that forms a pathway that within the brain is called a tract. Within our peripheral system, we call that a nerve. So the brain is made up of tracts. The body gets that information by way of nerves. The cerebellum reaches its full structural growth by about the 15th to 20th year of our life. And as you might expect, with over 80% of the brain's neurons packed into less than 10% of the brain's volume, these densely packed cells have a lot of interconnections, many more synapses within the cerebellum than exists within our cerebral cortex. Our cerebral neurons typically interface with somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 neighboring cells. So again, our brain is very complex from that standpoint. Most of the time in a textbook, when you see neurons represented, pictured, graphically shown, kind of like in what you see on the screen now, it is kind of one or two neurons and how they connect to another neuron. But in truth, they're connecting within our upper part of the brain, the cerebral area, between 1,000 and 10,000 cells. In the cerebellum, it is even more complex, roughly between 100 to 200,000 interconnections within the molecular layer. In other words, one Purkinje cell may interface with up to 200,000 synapses coming from those cells projecting from that granular layer. So it's an amazingly densely packed layer of billions of neurons that work collectively to make refinements. And those refinements are based on predictions from our prior knowledge and experiences. We'll talk about that later on in the big picture aspects of what the cerebellum is actually doing. So within this, you see there are three different layers that are represented off to one side. The three layers of the cerebellum, I'll show you on the next slide. The medullary layer that you see there at the very bottom, that layer is actually the white matter. That's where the information is coming in. So you see projections from cells that are passing through that area. Climbing fibers and mossy fibers are bringing information in. It goes into the granular layer where then it gets passed on and up into the Purkinje layer. So between the granular layer and the molecular layer, which is really represented here by a dotted line, there are those red cell bodies, the round dots along that dotted line. That is a layer within the cerebellum that is one cell layer thick. So the granular layer tightly packed with billions of cells, the molecular layer tightly packed with billions of axons and synapses. The Purkinje layer is a single cell layer of those very specialized cells. So as we move out, and again, stick with me on this. I know this is a lot of real fine detail. We want to talk about how the thing works, and then get into what its function is and how it actually does what it does. So when you move out into these outer layers from the inner white matter, you come to where the activity within the cortex of the cerebellum actually happens. Like the brain's cerebral cortex, the outer layers made up of tightly packed neurons that communicate with each other, and through projections and the subsequent white matter that they are passed on to other parts of the brain. The outer layers receive information from deep nuclei, which are pretty much analogous to the thalamus within the cerebral cortex, and then they relay those actions back to those deep nuclei where the orders are sent out to other regions of the brain. So these are the three layers that we talk about here. If you start at the top on the far right, the molecular layer, the Purkinje layer, and the granular layer. Below that is the white matter where the information is passed in and out. Within the granular layer, there are tiny granule cells. They make up that vast majority of the 80 billion cells that are located within the cerebellum. Through this layer also passes some of the incoming signals, mossy fibers, and projections from those fibers actually send excitatory signals to the granule cells. They interact with those granule cells. Granule cells are very small, very tightly packed, and they have a T-shaped axon. So you see represented here, the granule cells project an axon up and then a parallel fiber, which is also a part of that axon. So that axon goes up, forms a T, and then sends that axon parallel to the outside surface of the molecular layer. So it communicates across multiple different cells that lie within that region. So again, if you think of the Purkinje layer as being that one cell deep layer with all of these projections like a tree going up into the molecular layer, one of the granule cells can interact with thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of those Purkinje layers by way of that parallel fiber. That's what really forms those hundreds of thousands of synapses we talked about. This is a Purkinje cell. It is one of the earliest identified cells of the cerebellum, back when microscopes allowed us to start seeing things from prepared samples. And it's because it's a big cell. So it is easily identified. If you looked at a stained preparation, such as the one that you see on the right, you can see the large cell bodies and then the projections of the dendrites, the dendritic projections up into that molecular layer. The green ball appearing figure there on the left, that would be the cell body. The complex branches represent those dendritic branches that receive signals from 100,000 to 200,000 other cells. Not shown here is a single axon that then would project down from that cell body to send a signal to the interior of the cell. These connections between these densely packed cells interface with the branch of the Purkinje cells. They're excitatory in nature. So in other words, all of the T cells, all of those parallel fibers that are interacting with the Purkinje's receptors, they are excitatory. So they add to the likelihood that that Purkinje cell will fire. With enough excitatory signal, the Purkinje cell fires a single signal down its axon into the deep cerebellar nuclei. The signal that the Purkinje cell sends is inhibitory in nature. These cells are GABAergic. They utilize GABA as a neurotransmitter. So with a lot of excitatory input, these cells fire, resulting in an inhibitory function. So in other words, what's happening is positive excitatory incoming signals results in the firing of a cell that sends an inhibitory signal. Now, this is where it gets really complicated, because whether or not that inhibitory signal is ultimately something that stops something or allows something to happen depends on where that signal ultimately interfaces within the brain. I use a lot of automobile analogies, and this one would have to be, you got two pedals at your feet in a car with an automatic transmission, and the same action, pressing on a pedal, will either have a positive or negative impact on acceleration and speed. If you mix those up at the wrong time, bad things happen. If the inhibitory signal sends a message that is analogous to taking off the parking brake, for example, then the outcome of that inhibition is the result of potential movement. And so things can happen as a result of the Purkinje cell sending an inhibitory signal that takes off the brakes and allows something to happen, or sometimes slows things down. So just like the brakes and accelerator, depends on what it connects to. But basically, it's an extremely rich interconnection, and it results also in a tremendous speed of information processing. Now, deep within the cerebellum, there are these cerebellar nuclei that act as the main centers of communication. They receive and send information to and from specific parts of the brain. These are the cells within these nuclei that receive the excitatory and inhibitory signals from other parts of the brain that can affect or modulate the outgoing signals within the nuclei as well. We'll be talking about excitatory and inhibitory inputs and systems in terms of individual cell contributions and modulating input. But basically, this is like, again, the different actions and meta-actions of brain activity that we've talked about in other presentations. Regions of the brain that make things happen, they're excitatory in nature. Regions of the brain that dampen things down, make things stop happening, inhibitory. Both are equally important. The fibers that communicate with those deep nuclei from the brain stem are called peduncles, the superior, middle, and inferior peduncles. They connect the cerebellum to the midbrain, to the pons, and to the medulla. The superior is where information comes in, and the middle and inferior are where information goes out. Completely reversed. Yep, superior is efferent. Everything is going out of superior. I told you I was going to mix that up. Inferior and middle is where it's coming in.
I can't believe you mixed it up, Jeff. It's not even that complicated.
Yeah, really. I mean, they're different colors. How could I do that? Our cerebral cortex information travels down white matter by way of these peduncles into the deep nuclei of the cerebellum. It gets processed. It then gets passed out of the cerebellum by way of the peduncles. And these are just large bundles of nerve fibers, and they connect within the cerebral cortex. They connect with the thalamus primarily, and then back up to the cerebral cortex. Here's a very simple schematic that represents the manner in which information enters, processes, and leaves the cerebellum. The information travels in through the white matter, nuclei of the cerebellum, goes up, gets processed in those granular and molecular layers. So the input goes through the cells of the mossy fibers, which then get distributed to the granule cells. Remember, I said that was a very densely packed billions and billions of these little granule cells that then interface by way of that parallel fiber that they send up to Purkinje cells, which then send output. So that is the process. It is a one-way, unidirectional signal from input to output. Very little recurrent internal transmission. So in other words, information comes in, gets processed, gets spit out, and that happens really, really fast. Our cerebellar cortex is different than our cerebral cortex because there's a lot of resonant communication within the upper part of the brain. There's constant back and forth communication. With the cerebellum, it gets a signal, it processes that signal, and it outputs that signal. In that way, it's often analogous to computer parallel processing. A problem gets put into the processor, it gets divided up among multiple processors. Each of them take a piece of the problem so it can spit out a result much quicker. That is one of the ways in which the cerebellum has been considered to be very fast acting. The more processors you have, the quicker information can be processed and spit back out. Now, researchers have actually worked out that in terms of computer processing terms, I use a lot of analogies. I'm going to be talking about cars and computers. In terms of computer processing, our optic nerves, your vision, the optic nerves carry the equivalent of 80 gigabytes of information per second to the occipital lobes from your eyeballs. That is a lot of information, really, really fast. But in terms of pathways and connections, there are 40 times that number of nerve fibers within those peduncles that I talked about just a moment ago, which means that at its height, that amount of nerve fibers could carry, in terms of computer power, 3.2 terabytes of information per second that could potentially be processed or transmitted. I am presenting this on a ThinkPad X1 IBM computer, which has a 4.6 gigabyte processor. I think it's got 7 or 8 different divided processors within it. That means that something that my cerebellum has the capability of processing in 1 second would take this computer almost 12 minutes. That's how fast it is and how much information is running through your brain all the time. So again, the cerebellum can process a massive amount of information quickly because of that parallel processing, breaking something up and spitting it out. And the brain does this on a scale that is way beyond even our most sophisticated computers at this time. The cerebellum operates in conjunction with the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex, on a feedback loop. The input channel synapses in the pons crosses to the contralateral side, we call that decussation, and then connects to the cortex of the cerebellum. So in other words, things that the left side of your brain controls are mediated and moderated and controlled to some degree by the right side of the cerebellum before it gets sent back. Once the cerebellum has processed the information, the return path connects via those deep nuclei of the cerebellum over to the other side of the thalamus. So the right cerebellum is communicating with the left thalamus before that information goes back up to the cortex. It represents the role of the cerebellum in every process that we have traditionally attributed only to the cerebral cortex. We always talk about how the body and brain are not separate. They're a single entity. Well, the cerebellum and the cerebrum also coexist as separate collections of structures, but with a common goal and purpose. They operate in an intricate interdependence that allows all that information whizzing back and forth between our neural cells to be as efficient, accurate, and predictive as it possibly can be. All right, we're going to start to broaden our view a little bit now, talk about bigger picture concepts. First, from the standpoint of function. The organization of the inputs and outputs in terms of evolutionary mechanics goes from basic and primary functions, balance, spatial orientation, to things that are higher order, fine-tuning and modulation of body and limb movements, more in the medial zone. Then out to the lateral zone, where it really involves input from the cerebral cortex and all of our higher order processes, such as planning movement that's about to occur, predicting algorithms, and evaluation of sensory input, and the possible need to act on such information. And that includes purely cognitive functions. The vermis that I mentioned earlier, the region there on either side of it that you see that is kind of got a dotted line to it, that dotted line, everything in between those two dotted lines, that is considered the spinocerebellum. That is primary motor function within that area. The stuff that is outside of that, further away from the center, more lateral in nature, is called the cerebrocerebellum, and that does some regulation of motor, but its primary function now appears to be cognitive and emotional in nature. So those interconnections go to those outer aspects of those lobules where they are processed. By way of example here on what the cerebellum does. In a feedback control, think of this as a standard old-style thermostat on your wall. You input instruction. You set the temperature that you want it at. The controller takes that input and then sends a signal to the controlled object, in this case, your HVAC unit, and produces an output response. And then you see there is a loop back to the controller because it has to monitor that. When it reaches the right temperature that you have set, it has to send a different signal to your HVAC unit and turn it off. So once you've achieved whatever temperature you want set, that is now going to regulate that by way of the controller and the object. Nowadays, we got smart thermostats that have all kind of adaptive mechanisms to them, and that would be the feed forward and feedback control that you see below. If I tell my Nest thermostat that I want my house in the wintertime to be 68 degrees at 7 o'clock in the morning, that would be the equivalent maybe of walking over and setting it to 68 degrees at 7 a.m. But it would take a little while for the house to actually get to 68 degrees. What an adaptive mechanism does is on the basis of what it learns over time with how long it takes my HVAC unit to get to 68, it will actually, if I tell it I wanted it 7 a.m. to be 68 degrees, it's going to turn on before 7 a.m. so that at 7 a.m. we are right where we want to be. So that adaptive mechanism predicts on the basis of information all the stuff that we need to know in order to achieve the goal. Now, you really didn't come here to learn about my, personal environmental control system, so you're justified if right now you're scratching your head and saying, what the heck does this have to do with the cerebellum? Well, it is analogous to what the cerebellum does. It monitors our cerebrum, our upper brain. It reads the inputs and it predicts on the basis of our prior habits and experiences what is likely to come next and to prepare the brain for that process. From research, we can currently tell everything that the cerebellum does is below our threshold of conscious awareness. All that prediction is on an unconscious basis, reflecting our prior knowledge and experiences. You can artificially stimulate cells within the brain by way of transcranial magnetic stimulation, and actually perceive what is happening. You can feel something, you can smell something, you can have a certain memory jogged by that transcranial magnetic stimulation. Do that to the cerebellum, you don't experience anything. There is no perception associated with stimulation of that part of the brain. It is below our level of conscious awareness. Just like adjusting the temp before you want to hit that mark, stopping a train or stopping your car at a predetermined spot requires that you apply the brakes before you get to that spot. I use the example of a train because, within a station, the engineer has to know where to stop the train in order for everybody to get on and get off. And in doing that, you have to start putting on the brakes before you get there. You do the same thing in your car when you come to a stop sign. You start putting on the brakes, and the amount of pressure that you put on the brakes and how constant that is going to depend on whether or not your intended action, stopping at the stop sign, is being achieved. And you're constantly monitoring that, the motor signals that you are sending are on that basis. When you've been driving for a while, you're not really paying attention to it. It's almost subconscious in nature. And it's because your conscious brain, which has to learn how to do that, your cerebral cortex, at one point had to learn that and had to do it over and over and over again. You programmed through those repeated procedural processes your cerebellum to run that program. And now your cerebellum is capable of running such a complicated program without you really having to think about it. The demonstration time that I had in here was really brief when I did this live not too long ago, because I just took a spongy little squeezy stress ball brain and tossed it at somebody without warning them ahead of time. And what they did was they caught it. Thank goodness, because that's what I was going for. And what that demonstrated was something that was unanticipated, but was automatic, being able for that person to predict as that object was moving toward them, where to put their hand in order to meet it in the air as it got closer. That is really complicated, but your brain does it without you even thinking about it. And that process, from a motor standpoint, is also what the cerebellum is doing when it comes to our cognitive and our emotional processing. These facts that you see on the screen right now are primary functions that you will find in most medical textbooks. If you look up what the cerebellum does, it will tell you motor. It is involved in motor functioning. That is true. It is involved in motor functioning, but that's not the whole story. The function of the cerebellum, as we are finding out more and more, is beyond that. So here's where we are. Basically, if you read that and boil it down to what does that statement say, it says it might do some cognitive stuff, but we're not sure how at the moment. And this is 2023. So there are some researchers that would argue that we know more than that, and I'll tell you a little bit about what they've found. These three in the year 2000 said this as well. Now I went into psychology because I don't like math that much, and it wasn't until they introduced statistics that I realized I was going to have to use math. But I can tell you that this was 24 years ago. That's the kind of math I'm good at. It's relatively new in terms of the 17-year gap that typically exists between scientific discovery and adoption into practice. So one might ask the question, if we knew so much about this in 2000, how come our textbooks still tell us that the cerebellum is motor function and nothing else? Well, researchers have commented on that very question, up to and including within the past year. A direct quote from a 2024 article states, this is a quote, "We see the cerebellum all the time, but we don't know what to say about it." Now, these same authors pointed out that there remains much to be learned about the brain as a whole. So why should the cerebellum be any different? We did a presentation on the waste clearing aspects of the brain a few weeks ago called the glymphatic system, which was really only detailed and described within the last decade. And human research on it has only been within the last 4 or 5 years. So there's still a lot about the brain we don't know. So why shouldn't we not know things about the cerebellum as well? One potential explanation is that the cerebrum and the cerebellum have fundamentally different cellular architecture that allow for different computational capacities. Wherein the cerebral cortex has 6 layers within the gray matter, the cerebellum has 3. The cerebellum's principal output is inhibitory in nature. The cerebral cortex is typically excitatory. The inhibitory output primarily comes from the Purkinje cell, which is a cell that only exists within the cerebellum. And then lastly, the organizational or computational circuits within the cerebrum are typically organized into columns. So the upper part of your brain, those well-mapped areas of the cerebral cortex, they are organized in columns, whereas the expansive input of the microzone to the Purkinje cell in the cerebellum it's just alien to the established wealth of brain science of the cerebrum. So it is very, very different. One other thing on this as well, a major factor that limits study of the cerebellum, it's its location. It's located within the skull and oriented in such a way that it's tucked beneath the cerebrum. It makes it, and this is another quote, easy to overlook and harder to study. It is less prone to stroke-related focal injury, so it doesn't have the isolated stroke-related medical findings like Broca's area and Wernicke's area that were supported by numerous clinical cases. For the major methods of cognitive neuroscience, neuroimaging, neurophysiology, lesioning studies, and this is another quote from a research paper, the path of least resistance is to simply ignore the cerebellum. fMRI studies are frequently used to produce a whole brain analyses, but many of these studies use acquisition parameters that exclude the cerebellum. Software packages for scans often mask out the cerebellum by default. It's also difficult to utilize EEG or MEG studies or transcranial magnetic stimulation due to the distance and orientation of the neuronal populations that you're interested in studying. So it is hard to study with the methods that we have right now. Now, progress is being made on all these fronts, and higher resolution cerebellar atlases are becoming available, as well as registries of individuals with isolated cerebellar dysfunctions for study. So as more researchers focus on this area of the brain, perhaps our understanding will improve over time. Now, back to the feedback loop that we talked about before, in this case, for a purely cognitive function. The input channel synapses on the pons, crosses to the contralateral side, goes to the cortex of the cerebellum. The return path, exactly the same as motor, crosses back over to the thalamus, goes to the cerebrum. This polysynaptic circuitry is a major contributor also to the difficulty in establishing the organization of the connections between specific areas of the cerebrum and the cerebellum, because they are not monosynaptic in nature. In other words, there is not a single neuron that projects from a place in the cerebral cortex to another place in the cerebellar cortex. There are stops along the way. Traditional means of staining cells and looking at where do they go are monosynaptic in nature. So researchers actually had to get really creative to be able to figure out how to cross those synaptic boundaries to be able to start mapping things. The way they did it was by introducing a virus. Introduce a virus into a single cell, and then that virus will spread across the cells with which it synapses. Wherever the axon goes, it will cross over to the next cell, and that allows tracing of polysynaptic circuits. So these researchers, Milton and Strick, actually demonstrated that prefrontal areas of the brain not associated with motor function in this case went to areas of the cerebellum. The further advances in this technique by other researchers found other kind of closed loop circuits. So this is relatively new stuff going on here. I'm going to skip over that. There have been now connections demonstrated between several different areas of the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum, and they are outside of those associated with either primary or secondary motor mapping. So all of these different networks here are looking at associations cognitively, and the networks are represented within the cerebellum proportional to the size of the networks represented in the cerebrum. So in other words, if you have somebody, look at a picture of a penguin and say the word penguin. The places that fire on the left side of your brain associated with language and associative networks, they are sending signals to the right cerebellar cortex, and an equal proportion of the brain is involved from the standpoint of the cerebral cortex as well as the cerebellar cortex. So there is that asymmetry of organization. The left hemisphere, for example, dominates in language functioning. The right cerebellar cortex dominates in terms of what's happening when we are communicating in language functioning. And here's a collection of articles that are looking at a host of different cognitive and emotional functioning that can be traced directly to the cerebellum. These are all very recent or even upcoming publications. And as more labs start taking on this challenge of finding out what is connected to where and what the role of those connections is in the output of behavior, emotion, and movement, then we get more and more information to sort out and apply to what we're trying to do in a rehab setting as well. A lot, again, we mentioned earlier that the cerebellum is less vulnerable to injury. So when you're talking about, some type of diffuse, severe traumatic brain injury, oftentimes there are cerebellar functions that are intact and that allow things to happen that the cerebral cortex is not capable of doing at that moment because of either focal damage or communication damage leading to and from it. It's kind of like, folks often with aphasia, they're still able to produce some spontaneous automatic speech. What do you say when you hit your hammer, hit your thumb with a hammer? That automatic speech that pops out is probably not cerebrally driven. It's probably more cerebellar driven. It is probably a automatic program that is able to be executed. Other things that are kind of more associated with the cerebellum when it comes to communication are probably in effect when we're using things like melodic intonation as a treatment for aphasia, using having an individual sing a phrase instead of say it, is often more easily accomplished, and it is likely because of those overlearned and programmed aspects of cerebellar input that can support damaged cerebral cortical areas of damage. Now, if you really, really want to get deep in the weeds, here's a table from a study that was published this year that graphically represents the interconnection of various aspects of the different lobes of the cerebellum with major landmarks, lobes, and structures of the cerebral cortex. So the colored blocks that you see in the middle column, that are cerebral areas. So in other words, the area of the brain associated with the precentral gyrus, where does it interface? The superior frontal gyrus is one that has multiple different connections with just about every lobe across there. So different functions and where they connect with. So there's a huge amount of interconnectivity with the frontal lobes, with the precentral gyrus, with the paracentral lobule, with the thalamus, and with other structures within the brain. Those are direct connections. If they visually trace those axonal pathways interconnecting various aspects of the cerebrum with the cerebellum, you see here a very rich network and interconnection of every lobe, every gyrus, every nucleus within the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum. If you look across that top row, you'll also notice the extent and range of cerebellar connections to the frontal cortex, to the motor cortex, and to the parietal cortex. And they all appear to be relatively similar. They go to just about every lobe and aspect of the cerebellum. So again, this represents a single subject mapping. We all develop our own unique brain, in terms of our lifetime of experiences. This supports past research that's examined groups of individuals who have isolated cerebellar lesions that revealed a collection of issues that are non-motor in nature. So in other words, impaired spatial cognition as a result of exclusively cerebellar damage. Dysprosody, a disruption of the variation in melody, intonation, pauses, stresses, and accents of speech. With that type of dysfunction, we would normally think that that is cerebral in nature, but it also can be produced by very specific damage within the cerebellum. Anomia, an inability to recall words or names, often a selection anomia, where word retrieval is lost. This can come from a primary language disruption or a retrieval failure, but it relates to the organizational operations associated with frontal functioning and cerebellar processing. So it is involved in everything that we do. Specifically for executive functioning, and this is one where with individuals who have exclusively cerebellar injury, damage, very localized as in terms of a stroke, they're rare, but they do occur, you can get very clear frontal, what you would call frontal symptoms, even though the cerebellum is about as far from the frontal lobe as you can get and still be inside the skull. So the cerebellum is very much involved with the automatic execution of a lot of frontal things that we learn over time. Auditory processing has been linked with cerebellar processing, and in fMRI studies, similar patterns and proportional representations are seen in the cerebellum that correspond to the primary auditory cortex in the cerebrum. Studies have not found consistent, significant representation of visual processing in the cerebellum. Visual may be explained more by the extensive cerebral representation of visual and processing areas. Now, you have the entire occipital lobe exclusively dedicated to the processing of visual information. But again, go back to motor. The motor aspects of visual tracking, target acquisition, these are clearly associated with cerebellar functioning. But less is known, again, about the role of the cerebellum in visual processing. One of the clinical signs you may look for when it comes to visual functioning are the fluidity, the smoothness of those saccades as the eyes are following a target. That disruption within the cerebral central area, the cerebellar central area can very much be manifested by that disruption of our smooth saccades. All of this information about the cerebellum's role of non-motor functions has resulted in a shift in the conceptualization of cerebellar syndrome. Cerebellar syndrome was traditionally defined as motor dysfunction, also called ataxia, which included impaired balance and gait, incoordination of voluntary movements, dysarthria, the motor aspects of speech. It's now recontextualized as a three-part syndrome: cerebellar motor syndrome, cerebellar vestibular syndrome, and cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome. So the cerebellum has a strong role in fear conditioning, in emotional learning through its connections with midbrain regions, such as the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. Evidence also supports the cerebellum as a key structure for social cognition. That's an important one as well. The cerebellum is increasingly recognized as playing a significant role in social cognition by helping us learn and understand social action sequences, allowing us to predict and anticipate future social interactions and facilitating smooth social behavior through its ability to detect violations of social norms and adapt accordingly. So essentially, like everything else that the cerebellum is involved in, it acts as a predictor in social events, and it enables appropriate responses in social situations. The automaticity of what to do in a given social situation based upon multiple prior repetitions and past experiences. That's what we are talking about here. I have seen so many extremely confused individuals post severe brain injury who are not capable of following simple commands, either presented verbally or non-verbally, but automatic things like, well, you stick out your hand in front of them, offering that handshake, And there's an automatic response. You will almost always get that back, provided the person has the motor ability to move that arm and hand. So it is really demonstrating that in the same way that our brain sends signals to relax muscles and make purposeful movement, we manipulate that within our brain. We do the same thing in terms of thought and control objects as an idea or concept. Now, again, this is more difficult to represent because it represents hypothetical constructs. We're able to see movement and action. We're not able to see thoughts and emotions. We have to have that represented. But when you think about throwing a ball, if you visualize throwing a ball to someone, your brain fires off all of the cells that are necessary from the premotor cortex and the motor cortex to make that happen. And then the neuronal circuitry involved in that also shuts it down. It prevents that from occurring if you're not attempting to actually do that in the moment. So again, that is kind of the thought associated with a given action as opposed to the action itself. There's a fair amount of research that's looking at the association between cerebellar dysfunction and various mental disorders as well. If our thought prediction metric is off, doesn't it make sense that our thought outputs might also give us faulty or aberrant feedback? Particularly from the standpoint of what we were talking about a minute ago, of that social prediction. Autism in particular is shown to have a very strong association with dysfunction within various regions of cerebellar functioning. For many years, BASF, the world's largest chemical company, was one of the most recognizable company mottos for the motto that we had here. We don't make a lot of the products you buy, we make a lot of the products you buy better. The cerebellum really does not generate a lot of signal with the exception of some reflexes, spinal reflexes. But what it does is it refines our thought processes. It refines our motor processes. It refines our behavioral processes. There are a couple of computer scientists, Leiner was their name, Leiner and Leiner, married couple, and they were very involved early on in the IBM J.T. Watson Research Center. You probably would associate IBM and Watson with AI, and that's exactly what they were interested in. How can we create computers that kind of emulate neural systems? And Henrietta's interest in neural systems was so strong that she actually switched fields to neuroanatomy. She studied at Columbia University in New York, and in retirement for more than 2 decades, the Leiners were engaged in an interdisciplinary effort to analyze cerebrocerebellar networks because of that automaticity, the ability to program. So basically, their position was that our upper brain, the cerebral cortex, programs the cerebellar cortex to engage in things automatically, leaving us free to think about other things. Roles of prediction, preparation, and importantly, automaticity. From a motor standpoint, we know the cerebellum is involved in the process by which novel motor tasks can, with repetition and practice, be performed automatically. Things that need to be performed automatically to be really, really smooth, that needs to be handed off to a part of the brain that is not engaging in conscious activity. I read one time, and I don't know if this is necessarily true, but it'd be interesting to try it out. If you're a tennis player, if you want to disrupt the serve of your opponent, you ask them, do you inhale or exhale when you throw the ball up in the air? And the reason for that is it is an automatic function. And if you interfere with that through active conscious thought, it disrupts the movement. So to the extent that we can perform mental or physical activities without conscious attention to detail, that leaves our conscious part of the brain free to attend to other mental activities. The dynamic environment when that action, in which that action is taking place, for example, leaves you free to react to that. It enlarges your brain's cognitive scope and effectiveness. So again, think of it as cognitive programs, motor, cognitive, and emotional, that need to be designed, written, tested, refined, and then solidified in code. Our active and conscious brains, our cerebral cortex, is engaged in programming those unconscious and automatic processes, which lets us fly on autopilot while providing subtle input as needed. Again, always go back to the example of driving a car in a dynamic and unpredictable environment. Meanwhile, you're thinking about where you're going to get dinner tonight or wondering whether or not you left the stove on. As we develop greater automaticity, it allows us to perform a given ability, motor, cognitive, or emotional, and you get better at them and more efficient and faster the more you practice them. So in his book, The Cerebellum, Brain for an Implicit Self, author Masao Ito points out that neuroimaging has revealed that neuronal activity associated with motor imagery is required to stimulate a movement. The same thing happens in a mental model of movement. Again, I mentioned a minute ago, you think about a movement, you activate those areas, but you suppress the actual execution of the motor action. This serves as a model for the psychological counterpoint of the cerebral cortical models that are applied to cognitive functions and emotional functions. Repeated thoughts form an internal model, a default network of that cerebral mental model of those thoughts. A cerebellar forward and inverse model can copy that essential property of the mental model. Now, what we don't know is exactly how that cerebellar representation is formed, exactly where it's stored. But that model, you can think of that and envision a cerebellar model that is transferred from the cerebrum to the cerebellum and now is free to be called upon without occupying our cognitive resources. So it's an automaticity. And that is very important when it comes to how our brain functions and what allows us to pay attention to other things. Now, at the end of just about every research write-up, you're going to see there's a section that talks about what we don't know or areas that need further exploration. With regard to the brain in general and to the cerebellum in particular, this is an exciting time if you love learning, because there is so much to learn. There are so many changes, so many new discoveries, so much information coming out regularly that gives us a better understanding of how the brain operates and the complex interactions that we attempt to represent through neural network communications. Given the findings over the past couple of decades in redefining our understanding of the cerebellum, I would anticipate that continued new data will be built on the shoulders of every established consensus. The implications for injury and for recovery of function changes as our understanding of the brain changes. So it's important information to incorporate within rehabilitation. At present, science is still figuring out exactly how all this stuff fits together, but we will keep learning and keep trying to build from there. So I want to wrap it up, Steve, so that you've got time to get your poll question in. So let's jump to that, shall we?
Yep, going to launch the poll question now. Please answer that. Hopefully, Jeff, I think you did a great job highlighting the answer to this. We do have some questions. I know we're getting up on time. Jeff, I'm going to go ahead and throw a few of these at you. If you have to sign off, totally get it. This is recorded, so if you have to sign off early, we can send you the recording. It's also on our YouTube channel, usually about a day after the presentation by the time we get it loaded up. So a couple questions on the Q&A.
Oh, yeah, I had chat open. I didn't have Q&A open. Sorry, I might have
Okay,
answered.
so I don't know if you want to hit a couple of those. There's 3 on the top from Becky, Dr. LaCroix, and then...
Well, if someone had cerebellar dysfunction, what would a clinical specialist would be best to evaluate and treat that? PM&R and neuropsychology combination, I think, would be from a motor standpoint. I think PM&R often leans a little bit more toward neuropsychology taking the piece of cognitive and emotional functioning. But the physical signs associated with cerebellar dysfunction are typically going to be very clearly evident in a clinical evaluation. And I think a PM&R doc is probably one that is very involved from that standpoint.
One other thing just to add is just
yes.
the clinical involvement from a physical therapist, occupational therapist, an SLP, even a psychologist, to the point of some of what you've spoken about today. I think it's just important to have a multidisciplinary approach because of the things that Jeff mentioned around this isn't just a motor aspect of the brain, right? It's involved in the emotional aspects of what we do, the cognitive aspects, as well as the physical. So in addition to saying, hey, there's a cerebellar injury, we also have to treat the injury too. And I think having those disciplines involved is important.
Yep. I had a question earlier, reference to the involvement of the cerebellum with pain, and just wanting a little bit more information about that. As with any mental representation or any perceptual representation within the brain, if repeated, it does become a default network. And if indeed the cerebellum is involved in programming and the automaticity of running some of those programs, then pain certainly would fit into that as well. So the repeated experience could certainly be something that could be, cerebellar in nature, in addition to being cerebral networks involved. Because it's involved in just about everything so far that research has been able to find, with communication with all the different areas of the brain, undoubtedly it has a role in the automaticity of that experience as well. There's also a question that kind of relates to that, which is, have any TBI treatments been changed or modified yet based on this new information in what has been learned about the cerebellum? To my knowledge, I think, and this is true often of rehab, we do things that make sense and that we see are effective, and then later on, science tells us why that works. And this may be very well one of those cases. We know that with support, with structure, and with repetition, individuals can gain both procedural and cognitive skills following a severe injury. And this may in part explain part of the reason why that is possible, that parts of the cerebellum that are capable of learning those and running those routines that we teach through repeat, if that part of the brain is capable of executing that cognitive function, even if the cerebral aspects of that skill are now compromised, it does give us that ability. And on the other side of that as well, if you have deficits from the standpoint of exclusively cerebellar damage, an individual may very well be able to overcome that through conscious reprogramming, through conscious execution. So in other words, if you have impulse control disorder, kind of a frontal executive type of presentation, as a result of purely cerebellar damage, your cerebral cortex, your cognitive aspects of conscious thought, can allow you to learn in a different way, perhaps in a different pathway, but basically learn to execute that previously automatic function that you developed through childhood and adolescence of inhibiting those automatic impulses. And so being able to do that by programming the cerebellum by supported repetition, we know works. So this might explain why.
Jeff, I can't help but think about implicit versus explicit learning.
Yes.
In this, you haven't really said those two terms out loud, and not to get too technical, but to your point around, if you have a cerebellar injury, using some explicit skills or explicit strategies to, learn and kind of take over for the cerebellum, so to speak. On the flip side, I think the cerebellum appears to have a very implicit interaction or an implicit way of helping us function. And so I think using both of those terms and leveraging the benefits of both appears to really apply in this scenario, whether you're talking about motor, cognitive, emotional functioning. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yep, very much so. And I have put up my contact information there. So again, if you have questions that weren't answered here, if you want to email me directly, or if you want to email Steve or Don to ask your questions, I would be glad to take other questions as well.
Great. Well, thank you, Jeff. Always great information. I love your ability to take something that's extremely complicated and break it down, the analogies, I know you're joking around about your car and your computational system over there, but I do think those are really helpful to take something that's complicated and simplify it as much as we can. But again, thank you for joining us in terms of our audience. We'll actually have Jeff back next month as well. We'll be talking about optimism, and excited for that topic too. And once again, thanks for joining us. We hope you have a great rest of your day, rest of your week, and we appreciate you returning back to us and to learn and join us. So thanks again. Have a great day. Jeff, take care.
Thank you.